Chapter 1, The Consultant. Michael Brennan had learned to read a room within the first 30 seconds of entering it. 23 years of government contracting had taught him that much. The fluorescent lights humming overhead, the arrangement of chairs, the temperature set just slightly too cold, these were the physical tells. But the real information came from faces, who made eye contact, who shuffled papers, who checked their watch before the meeting even began. The conference room on the third floor of the Department of Energy's satellite office in Socorro, New Mexico, was colder than usual. March 1987, and someone had cranked the air conditioning like it was mid-July. Michael set his briefcase on the table and took the seat they'd left open for him, the one facing the window so the afternoon sun would be in his eyes. Another tell. Mr. Brennan, thank you for coming on such short notice. The speaker was Dr. Patricia Chen, Deputy Director of something or other. Michael had stopped trying to keep track of all the rotating titles. Her handshake had been firm but brief, her smile practiced. She was in her early 40s, he guessed, with steel-gray streaks beginning to thread through her black hair, pulled back severely from her face. Not a problem, Michael said, opening his briefcase with the practiced calm of someone who'd sat through hundreds of these preliminary meetings. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and his favorite fountain pen, a Waterman his wife Susan had given him for their 15th anniversary. The weight of it in his hand was comforting. Though I'll admit the vagueness of the request was intriguing. Chen glanced at the two men flanking her. The one on her left was younger, maybe 35, wearing a suit that looked like it had come straight from a Sears catalog. His Pentagon ID badge proclaimed him to be James Richter, but he had that studied blankness that suggested James Richter might not be his actual name. The man on Chen's right was older, 60s probably, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent significant time outdoors. No ID badge visible. He hadn't introduced himself at all. We need an independent assessment, Chen began, sliding a thin manila folder across the table toward Michael. A facility audit, essentially. Infrastructure, safety protocols, personnel management practices. Standard stuff for someone with your background. Michael didn't touch the folder yet. Ma'am, with respect, you don't fly someone in from Denver for standard stuff. You've got plenty of local contractors who could handle a routine audit. The older man's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but acknowledgement. Chen's expression didn't change. The facility in question requires someone with your specific clearances and your... She paused, choosing her word carefully, discretion. There it was. Michael had been expecting it, but it still sent a familiar prickle down his spine. Discretion was code. It meant things that don't get written down, conversations that never happened, reports that might disappear into filing cabinets and never emerge. He'd been here before. Los Alamos in '79, looking into discrepancies in plutonium accounting that turned out to be nothing more than sloppy bookkeeping and Cold War paranoia. Hanford in '82, where the real problem wasn't the aging reactors but the 50-year-old infrastructure held together with rust and prayer. He'd written his reports, made his recommendations, collected his checks, and moved on. The work paid well, and Susan had stopped asking too many questions after the first few years. What kind of facility? Michael asked. Research, Richter said. His voice was flat, Midwestern. High-energy physics applications. It's a small operation, relatively new. About 4 years old. Location? That'll be in the briefing materials, Chen said, tapping the folder with one manicured fingernail. After you sign. Michael opened the folder. The non-disclosure agreement was thorough, 3 pages of dense legal text that essentially boiled down to, tell no one anything ever, or we will destroy you. He'd signed dozens like it. He read it carefully anyway, then accepted the pen Richter offered him and added his signature to the bottom of each page. Chen collected the NDA and replaced it with a thicker document. The facility is designated Sierra 7. It's located approximately 43 miles northeast of here, in the foothills of the Magdalena Mountains. Remote location, restricted access road. The official designation is an atmospheric research station, which is technically true. There is weather monitoring equipment on site. But that's not what they're actually doing, Michael said. That's not what they're primarily doing, Chen corrected. The research is classified, but for your purposes, you don't need to know operational details. You're assessing the physical plant, the safety measures, the management structure. Making sure everything meets federal standards. Michael scanned the briefing document. Staff of 37. Generator backup systems. Multiple underground levels. Water reclamation. Standard stuff for a remote research facility, though the underground component was interesting. When do I start? Tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. A driver will pick you up from your hotel. We've made arrangements at the Holiday Inn on California Street. The initial visit will be a full walkthrough, probably take most of the day. After that, you'll have access as needed to complete your assessment. We're looking for a preliminary report in 2 weeks, final report in 30 days. Michael nodded, closing the folder. Who's my point of contact on site? Dr. James Veldman. He's the facility director. Chen's tone had shifted slightly, something Michael couldn't quite identify. Not quite disapproval, but close. He's been with the project since its inception. Very dedicated to the work. The older man who still hadn't introduced himself finally spoke. His voice was gravelly, the kind that came from too many cigarettes over too many years. Mr. Brennan, I want to be clear about something. This is a professional courtesy. Dr. Veldman requested an outside review to ensure compliance with safety regulations. This is not an investigation. There's no problem we're aware of. This is routine, proactive oversight. Michael had learned to recognize lies by omission. Understood, he said, which was neither agreement nor challenge. They talked for another 20 minutes about logistics, security protocols, authorized areas, photography restrictions. Standard operating procedure. Michael took notes in his careful, methodical handwriting, filling 3 pages of his legal pad with details that he'd later transcribe into his personal files. Susan always joked that he could have been a court reporter with his note-taking skills. When the meeting ended, Michael gathered his materials and shook hands again all around. The older man's grip was strong, his palm calloused. Military, probably. Intelligence background, possibly. Someone who'd been around long enough to know how the game was played. Outside, the New Mexico sun was blinding after the dim conference room. Michael stood in the parking lot for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, feeling the dry heat sink into his shoulders. March in New Mexico was schizophrenic, cold mornings, warm afternoons, cold nights. He'd packed for variable weather. His rental car, a brown Chrysler LeBaron that had seen better days, was parked in the visitor section. He tossed his briefcase into the passenger seat and sat behind the wheel, but didn't start the engine yet. Instead, he stared through the windshield at the scrubby landscape beyond the office park, the distant mountains purple against the blue sky. Something was off. He couldn't articulate it yet, couldn't point to any single thing that Chen or Richter or the unnamed older man had said. But Michael had been doing this work long enough to trust his instincts, and his instincts were whispering that this wasn't routine at all. He thought about calling Susan. She'd be home now, probably in the garden with her roses. She worried when he took jobs that required NDAs, though she never said so directly. Instead, she'd ask careful questions about the hotel, about how long he'd be gone, about whether he'd remembered to pack his blood pressure medication. All the mundane details that meant I need you to come home safely. Michael started the car and drove toward the hotel instead. He'd call her tonight, after he'd had time to think. After he'd read through the briefing materials more carefully. After he'd tried to figure out what Chen and her colleagues weren't telling him. The Holiday Inn was exactly what he'd expected, generic, clean, anonymous. He checked in, carried his single suitcase to a room on the 3rd floor, and spread the briefing documents across the bed. For the next 2 hours, he read and reread every page, making additional notes, looking for inconsistencies or gaps. The facility had been built quickly, according to the timeline. Groundbreaking in late 1982, operational by early 1983. That was fast for a government project, even a small one. The budget line items were heavily redacted, but he could see enough to know this hadn't been cheap. Multiple contractors, expedited permits, enhanced security measures from day one. And then there was the staff list. 37 names, mostly PhDs in physics, engineering, materials science. But also medical personnel, 2 doctors, 3 nurses, more than seemed necessary for a facility that size. And the footnote at the bottom of the page, staff roster current as of January 1987. Personnel changes pending administrative review. Pending administrative review. That could mean anything from routine rotations to people quitting to people being fired. Or worse. Michael set the papers aside and walked to the window. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere out there, 43 miles northeast, was a facility that officially existed as an atmospheric research station but was really something else entirely. A place where 37 people worked on classified research that required underground laboratories and medical staff and enough power generation to run a small town. A place he'd be visiting in, he checked his watch, 11 hours. He should eat something. He should call Susan. He should review his notes one more time before tomorrow. Instead, Michael stood at the window and watched the light fade from the sky, trying to shake the feeling that had settled into his chest like a stone. The feeling that once he drove out to Sierra 7 tomorrow morning, something fundamental would change. That there would be a before and an after, and the after would be harder to live with. But that was ridiculous. This was just another audit, another facility, another report to write. He'd done this dozens of times. There was no reason this should be any different. No reason at all. Michael turned away from the window and reached for the phone to call his wife. Chapter 2, Sierra 7. The driver arrived at 5:45, 15 minutes early. Michael was already waiting in the hotel lobby with his briefcase and a thermos of coffee from the Continental Breakfast Bar. The driver was young, maybe 25, with the rigid posture and short haircut that marked him as military even in civilian clothes. He introduced himself only as Rodriguez, and said nothing else as they loaded into a white government sedan. They drove northeast out of Socorro as dawn broke across the desert. The landscape was austere in the early light, creosote bushes, scattered junipers, red earth that seemed to glow as the sun touched it. Rodriguez drove in silence, taking Highway 60 for about 20 miles before turning onto a smaller state road, then onto a dirt track that wasn't marked on any map Michael had seen. The road climbed steadily into the foothills. After 30 minutes of jarring ruts and switchbacks, they reached a checkpoint, a simple metal gate across the road, a guard shack, 2 men in private security uniforms. Rodriguez showed his credentials. One guard walked around the vehicle with a mirror on a pole, checking the undercarriage. The other made a phone call. They waited. Michael studied the perimeter. Chain-link fence, 12 feet high, topped with razor wire. Security cameras on poles every 50 yards. Motion sensors, probably. This was more than weather monitoring station security. This was the kind of setup you'd see at weapons facilities, at places where the government kept things it didn't want anyone to see. The guard waved them through. The road continued for another mile, climbing higher, until they rounded a bend and Michael got his first look at Sierra 7. The facility was built into the side of a hill, partially submerged, partially camouflaged. The above-ground structures were low-slung, painted in desert tones that blended with the surrounding landscape. Solar panels covered one entire roof. A radio tower rose from the highest point, bristling with antennas and dishes. The atmospheric research equipment Chen had mentioned was visible, weather stations, wind monitors, all functioning and legitimate. But it was the entrance that caught Michael's attention. A reinforced concrete structure built into the hillside, with heavy steel doors that belonged on a bank vault. Whatever was important at Sierra 7 was underground. Rodriguez parked in a small lot next to 3 other vehicles. "Dr. Veldman is expecting you," he said, his first word since they'd left Socorro. "Through the main entrance. Someone will meet you." Michael climbed out of the sedan, briefcase in hand. The air was cold at this elevation, thin and sharp in his lungs. He could hear birds calling from the scrub oak scattered across the hillside. If not for the facility itself, this would have been a beautiful, peaceful place. The steel doors opened before he reached them. A woman in her 30s emerged, wearing a white lab coat over jeans and a denim shirt. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her smile seemed genuine, if tired. "Mr. Brennan? I'm Dr. Sarah Kerrigan, Assistant Director. Welcome to Sierra 7. She extended her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm cool. "Dr. Veldman is finishing up a briefing, but he asked me to start your tour. We can cover the upper levels first, then meet him below." Below confirmed what Michael had suspected. The real facility was underground. They passed through the steel doors into an airlock-style entry. Sarah swiped her badge, entered a code, and placed her hand on a biometric scanner. The inner door opened with a pneumatic hiss. Inside was a reception area that looked like any corporate office: beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a desk where a security guard sat monitoring multiple screens. Sarah signed Michael in, issued him a visitor badge that had to be worn visibly at all times, and led him down a corridor lined with offices. Through open doors, Michael glimpsed the mundane aspects of any workplace: filing cabinets, coffee mugs, charts on walls, people typing at computers. But there were differences. Everyone wore badges. Every door had a keypad lock. And there was a quality to the silence: people spoke in low voices, moved with purpose, didn't linger in hallways. "This level is administration and support services," Sarah explained. "Offices, meeting rooms, the cafeteria, medical bay. Most of the staff work below, but everyone comes up here for meals and breaks. We try to maintain some normalcy." She said this last part with a slight edge that Michael noted. "How long have you been with the project, Dr. Kerrigan?" 3 years. Since early '84. I came on after my postdoc at Berkeley." She led him through a break room where 2 technicians were refilling coffee cups. They glanced up, nodded at Sarah, studied Michael with undisguised curiosity. "It's good work. Important work. Dr. Veldman has assembled an exceptional team." "And what exactly is the work?" Michael asked, knowing he wouldn't get a real answer. Sarah smiled. "I'm sure Dr. Veldman will discuss what he can. My understanding is you're here to assess our safety protocols and infrastructure, not our research objectives." "That's correct. Though the two often intersect." They reached an elevator at the end of the corridor. Sarah pressed the call button. The facility has 3 underground levels. Level 1 is primary laboratory space and equipment rooms. Level 2 is specialized research areas. I'm afraid those are restricted, even with your clearances. Level 3 is infrastructure, generators, water systems, ventilation, storage. The elevator arrived. They stepped inside, and Sarah inserted her badge into a slot before pressing the button marked L1. The elevator descended smoothly, but Michael felt the pressure change in his ears. They were going deep. "How deep?" he asked. Level 1 is 60 feet below surface. Level 3 is just over 120. The elevator opened onto a different world. The corridor here was wider, the walls white tile that reflected the harsh overhead lighting. The air was cooler, processed, with a faint chemical smell Michael couldn't identify. The hum of machinery was constant: ventilation, power systems, the deep mechanical heartbeat of a facility built for purposes that required isolation and control. Sarah led him past laboratories with thick glass windows. Inside, researchers in full protective gear worked with equipment Michael recognized from his years in the nuclear industry: containment chambers, remote manipulators, monitoring stations with dozens of screens displaying data. But there was other equipment he didn't recognize, configurations that seemed wrong somehow, purposes he couldn't immediately determine. "We maintain strict contamination protocols," Sarah was saying. "Multiple redundant systems, constant air monitoring, automated safety interlocks. Everything is designed to fail safe." "Contamination protocols for what, exactly?" Michael asked. Sarah hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "I really should let Dr. Veldman address that." They continued the tour. Equipment rooms filled with machinery Michael understood, air handlers, electrical systems, backup generators. A medical bay larger than seemed necessary, with examination rooms and what looked like isolation chambers. A cafeteria where a dozen people were eating an early lunch, conversation stopping as he and Sarah passed through. And everywhere, Michael noticed the cameras. Not just security cameras, but something else, sensors, monitors, devices that tracked and recorded in ways he couldn't fully identify. This wasn't just about keeping people out. This was about knowing exactly what was happening inside, at all times, in every space. They were walking past another laboratory when Michael heard it, a sound that didn't belong, that cut through the mechanical hum and raised the hair on the back of his neck. It was brief, maybe 3 seconds. A sound that might have been human, might have been pain, might have been something else entirely. It came from behind a door marked L2 Access, authorized personnel only. Sarah heard it too. Michael saw her jaw tighten, saw her pace quicken slightly. "What was that?" he asked. "Probably equipment. Some of the machinery cycles in ways that can sound unusual." But her tone had changed. The professional warmth was gone, replaced by something careful and measured. They reached another elevator, and Sarah pressed the button. "Dr. Veldman should be ready for us now. He'll want to brief you personally on our research parameters and answer any questions I couldn't address." The elevator arrived. As they stepped inside, Michael glanced back down the corridor toward the restricted door. A man in a white coat was emerging, pulling off latex gloves, his face pale and drawn. He looked exhausted, or worried, or possibly both. He caught Michael's eye for just a moment before the elevator doors closed. They descended further into the earth, and Michael felt the weight of rock and secrecy pressing down from above, and something else pressing up from below, something Sarah hadn't explained, something Chen hadn't mentioned, something that made sounds behind locked doors that definitely weren't machinery. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. And Dr. James Veldman was waiting for them, his smile bright and his handshake firm and his eyes completely, utterly cold. "Mr. Brennan," he said. "Welcome to Sierra 7. I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what we're really doing here." Chapter 3, The Revelation. Dr. James Veldman's office was surprisingly sparse. No family photos, no diplomas on the walls, no personal touches that might reveal anything about the man behind the title. Just a metal desk, 3 chairs, and a filing cabinet with a combination lock. The only decoration was a large topographical map of New Mexico pinned to one wall, with Sierra 7 marked by a red pushpin. Veldman was younger than Michael had expected, maybe 45, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that he adjusted constantly. He moved with nervous energy, pouring coffee from a thermos without asking if Michael wanted any, then sitting down and immediately standing up again. "I requested this audit myself," Veldman said abruptly. "Chen probably didn't tell you that. She thinks I'm being paranoid, but I know what I've seen. I need someone from outside to document what's happening here before." He stopped himself, shook his head. "Let me start differently." Michael set down his untouched coffee and opened his briefcase, pulling out his legal pad. "Please do." Veldman sat down again, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "What do you know about high-energy particle interactions with biological systems?" "Very little. That's not my area of expertise." "Good. Then you won't have preconceptions." Veldman stood again, pacing to the map, then back. 4 years ago, we discovered something. An anomaly in particle behavior that suggested the possibility of targeted molecular manipulation. Not nuclear fission, not fusion, something else entirely. Something that could theoretically alter matter at the subatomic level with unprecedented precision. Michael wrote this down, though he understood only the general outline. And the military applications? Obvious, yes. But that's not what interested us. We were focused on medical applications. Imagine being able to target and eliminate cancer cells without radiation, without surgery. Imagine repairing genetic damage at the molecular level. The potential was extraordinary. Was? Michael caught the past tense. Veldman stopped pacing. His face had gone pale. The early tests on tissue samples were promising. Remarkable, even. We could eliminate malignant cells with 97% accuracy. So we escalated. Animal trials. Standard protocol, mice first, then rabbits, then primates. He walked to the filing cabinet, worked the combination lock with shaking hands, and pulled out a folder. He set it on the desk in front of Michael but didn't open it. The first indication something was wrong came 6 months into the primate trials. Subject 7, a rhesus monkey. We'd successfully eliminated a tumor. The animal was recovering normally. Then, 3 weeks post-treatment, it began exhibiting unusual behavior. Aggression, then lethargy, then seizures. When we did the necropsy, we found, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Cellular changes we couldn't explain. Not cancer. Something else. Something we'd created. Michael opened the folder. The photographs inside showed tissue samples, microscope images, charts tracking cellular degradation. He wasn't a pathologist, but even he could see that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The tissue looked wrong, corrupted, like it was breaking down and rebuilding itself simultaneously in patterns that defied normal biology. How many test subjects exhibited these changes? Michael asked quietly. All of them. Eventually. The onset varied, anywhere from 2 weeks to 3 months post-treatment. But every single animal we treated developed the same cellular degradation. And Mr. Brennan, Veldman's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. We couldn't stop it. Once it started, it was progressive, irreversible, and uniformly fatal. The sound Michael had heard in the corridor suddenly made terrible sense. The restricted areas on level 2. You're still running trials. Not animal trials. Not anymore. Veldman sat down heavily, removing his glasses to rub his eyes. 18 months ago, there was an accident. Dr. Marcus Webb, one of our senior researchers. Accidental exposure during a containment breach. The particle field was only active for 3 seconds, but it was enough. We knew what was coming, so he stopped, replaced his glasses. We offered him palliative care. He chose to participate in research. To help us understand what was happening to him, to maybe find a way to reverse it. Is he still alive? Yes. Barely. He's in isolation on level 2. Along with 5 others. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. 5 others? Were they all accidental exposures? Veldman's silence was answer enough. Michael set down his pen carefully. Dr. Veldman, are you telling me that you continued human trials after you knew the treatment was fatal? Not trials. Treatment. Veldman's voice had taken on a desperate edge. These were terminal patients, Mr. Brennan. Stage 4 cancers, weeks to live. They volunteered. They signed consent forms. They knew the risks. Did they know about the cellular degradation? Did they know what happened to the animals? They knew the procedure was experimental. They knew there could be complications. That's not what I asked. Veldman stood abruptly, walking to the wall map, his back to Michael. 3 of them were my colleagues. People I'd worked with for years. When they got sick, when conventional treatment failed, they came to me. They believed in this work. They wanted to be part of the solution. His voice cracked. Sarah's husband was one of them. Dr. David Kerrigan. That's why she's still here, even after he's been in isolation for 4 months. Michael thought about Sarah's careful words, her tight jaw, the exhaustion in her eyes. Does Chen know? Does the Pentagon know? They know we've had setbacks. They don't know the full extent. I've been trying to fix this, trying to find a reversal protocol before I have to file a complete report. But it's not working. Nothing's working. And the degradation is accelerating in the newer subjects. Michael closed the folder, his hands steady despite the horror of what he was hearing. You need to shut this down. Immediately. No more subjects. Full disclosure to oversight. If I do that, they'll classify everything, seal the facility, and bury 6 people alive in isolation until they die. No visitors, no communication, no dignity. They'll become non-existent. The project that officially never happened. Veldman turned back to face him, and his eyes were haunted. That's why I brought you here. I need someone to document this. Someone who can make sure that what happened to these people, what's still happening to them, doesn't just disappear. Through the office walls, muffled but distinct, came that sound again. The one Michael had heard in the corridor. Now he knew what it was. Not machinery. Not equipment. Chapter 4, Level 2. Michael had seen terrible things in his 23 years of government work. He'd toured reactor facilities where men had died invisible deaths from radiation. He'd read classified reports about chemical exposure incidents that would never make the news. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to separate the human cost from the technical assessment, to write his reports in clean, clinical language that made horror bureaucratic. But nothing had prepared him for Level 2. Veldman led him there after their conversation, after Michael had insisted on seeing the subjects himself. Sarah had tried to object, her face going white when Veldman announced they were going down. James, he doesn't need to see them. The documentation is sufficient. He asked, Veldman said quietly. And they deserve to be seen. They deserve to have someone bear witness who isn't already complicit. The elevator descended past Level 1, past Level 3, to a sublevel that hadn't been mentioned in any briefing document. The doors opened onto a corridor lined with thick glass windows, each looking into an isolation chamber. Medical equipment filled every room, monitors, 4 stands, ventilators. And in the beds, 6 people in various stages of cellular breakdown. Michael stopped at the first window. The patient inside was a woman, perhaps 60, though it was hard to tell. Her skin had taken on a grayish translucence, and through it he could see patterns of dark veins spreading like cracks in porcelain. Her eyes were open, tracking movement, conscious and aware. When she saw them, she raised one trembling hand in a gesture that might have been greeting or goodbye. Patricia Moss, Veldman said softly. Retired physics professor. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She had 6 weeks when she volunteered. That was 5 months ago. The treatment eliminated her tumor completely. Then this started. She's in pain, Michael said. It wasn't a question. He could see it in every line of her body, the way she held herself rigid against invisible agony. Constant. We manage it as best we can, but the pain receptors are part of the cellular degradation. Normal analgesics don't work the way they should anymore. They moved to the next window. A younger man, 30s maybe, his body covered in lesions that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. His eyes were closed, his breathing assisted by a ventilator, but the monitors showed brain activity. Still conscious, somewhere inside the failing shell of his body. Thomas Chen. Patricia's nephew. Veldman's voice was flat now, reciting facts as a defense against emotion. Leukemia. He saw what happened to his aunt and still volunteered. Said if the treatment could give them time to find answers, his death would mean something. Sarah had followed them down but stood back from the windows, her arms wrapped around herself. Michael noticed she wasn't looking at the rooms. She was looking at the floor, or the ceiling, or anywhere except at the people dying behind glass. "Which one is your husband?" Michael asked gently. She pointed to the fourth window without looking. "David. He's sleeping now. The seizures exhaust him." Michael walked to the window. Dr. David Kerrigan looked almost normal at first glance. The degradation was less advanced, the gray translucence barely visible except at his extremities. But his chart showed the progression. 2 weeks, maybe 3, before he reached Patricia Moss's stage. Maybe a month before he looked like the patient in the final room, whose body had become something that barely registered as human anymore. "How long?" Michael asked. "Until the end?" "It varies. Patricia has lasted the longest. The newest subject, in room 6, probably has days." Veldman pressed his hand against the glass of David's window. "We've tried everything. Reversal protocols, targeted interventions, experimental treatments. Nothing stops it. The cellular changes we initiated just keep cascading, keep spreading. It's like we taught their cells a new pattern, and now they can't remember the old one." A nurse emerged from one of the rooms, pulling off contamination gear. She was young, maybe 25, and her eyes had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen too much. She nodded at Veldman, registered Michael's presence with barely concealed hostility, and disappeared down the corridor. "The staff rotates through here on 2-week shifts," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "Any longer and, it's not good for them. Some of the researchers have asked for transfers. We don't have enough people anymore. And the ones who stay," she didn't finish the sentence. Michael turned away from the windows. "Dr. Veldman, you understand I have to report this. All of it. The unauthorized human trials, the ongoing exposures, the failure to disclose to oversight. This facility needs to be shut down immediately, and these people need to be transferred to a proper medical facility where." "Where what?" Veldman's voice cracked like a whip. "Where they'll be studied by new doctors who'll run the same useless tests. Where they'll die anyway, but in some military hospital instead of here where people actually know them, care about them." He gestured at the windows. "These aren't experimental subjects to us, Mr. Brennan. They're our colleagues. Our friends. Sarah's husband, for God's sake. We're not keeping them here out of scientific curiosity. We're keeping them here because this is their home, and we promised them we wouldn't let them die alone in some government black site." "But you did this to them," Michael said quietly. "You knew the risks and you proceeded anyway. You turned dying people into test subjects. They chose this." Veldman shouted. "Every single one of them chose this. They knew it was experimental, they knew we couldn't guarantee outcomes, and they chose to try anyway because the alternative was dying slowly, painfully, with no hope at all. We gave them hope. That it turned out to be false hope doesn't make their choice less valid." In the silence that followed, Michael heard it again, that sound from the corridor earlier. Now he could identify it, a moan of agony from one of the rooms, quickly muffled. Someone trying not to scream, failing, trying again. Sarah had started crying silently, tears running down her face as she finally looked at her husband's window. "He asked me to let him go," she whispered. "Last week. He said he was ready. But I can't. I keep thinking maybe tomorrow we'll find something, maybe one more day." "There isn't going to be a tomorrow," Michael said, the words coming out harsher than he'd intended. "Not for them. You know that. You've known it for months." Veldman slumped against the wall. "So what do I do? What am I supposed to do? Report it all and watch them get disappeared? Let them die knowing their suffering was for nothing?" Michael looked through the windows at the 6 people dying in their glass rooms. 6 people who'd volunteered for hope and gotten horror instead. 6 people whose deaths would be classified, whose names would be redacted, whose suffering would become another government secret buried in files that would never be opened. You document everything, Michael said finally. Every detail, every decision, every symptom. You make sure their names stay attached to this. And then you let me do my job. Chapter 5, The Report. Michael didn't sleep that night. He sat in his hotel room with the curtains open, watching the lights of Socorro twinkle in the darkness below, and tried to find words that could capture what he'd witnessed. Words that would survive classification, redaction, the inevitable bureaucratic machinery that would grind this tragedy into acceptable narrative. He wrote 3 versions of his report. The first was clinical, technical, exactly what Chen and her colleagues wanted, an assessment of safety protocols and infrastructure with carefully worded recommendations for improvement. It mentioned setbacks in experimental procedures and unforeseen complications requiring enhanced medical support. It was thorough, professional, and completely inadequate. The second version told the truth. Names, dates, decisions, consequences. It documented everything Veldman had shown him, everything Sarah had finally admitted through tears, everything he'd seen through those glass windows. It was the report that would destroy careers, end funding, possibly trigger criminal investigations. It was also the report that would never see daylight. The third version was something in between, enough truth to matter, enough documentation to prevent complete erasure, enough technical language to maybe survive the classification process. He worked on it for 12 days, making 3 more trips to Sierra 7, interviewing staff members who spoke in careful euphemisms, reviewing medical records that documented degradation in clinical detail. On his 4th visit, Patricia Moss died. He wasn't there when it happened, but Veldman called him that evening, his voice raw. 14 hours, he said. She was in pain for 14 hours at the end. We maxed out every analgesic we had. Nothing touched it. She was conscious until the last 10 minutes. Michael added it to his report. Subject 1, deceased after 167 days post-treatment. Cause of death, complete cellular failure secondary to experimental particle therapy. And then, because it mattered, because she deserved more than clinical language, patient remained conscious and aware throughout deterioration. Pain management inadequate. Died with family present. Thomas Chin died 3 days later. David Kerrigan lasted another week. Sarah stopped coming to work. Michael saw her once more, in the hallway outside the isolation ward, her face hollow and aged beyond her years. He asked me to tell his story, she said. To make sure people know this happened. That he wasn't just erased. I'll do my best, Michael promised, knowing it wasn't enough. He submitted his report on schedule, 30 days after his first visit. He sent copies to Chen, to her unnamed superior, to the oversight office in Washington. He kept his own copies, encrypted, backed up, stored in 3 separate locations. Insurance, though he wasn't sure against what. 2 weeks later, Chen called him. Your report was thorough, she said. Very thorough. Perhaps too thorough in certain sections. I documented what I observed. Yes. And we appreciate your diligence. The facility is being decommissioned. The research program has been terminated. Remaining subjects will be transferred to appropriate medical care. Where? That information is classified. Dr. Veldman. Dr. Veldman has been reassigned. I'm not at liberty to discuss personnel matters. Michael tried calling Veldman's office number. Disconnected. His home number. No answer. Sarah Kerrigan had disappeared as well. Her Berkeley colleagues said she'd taken indefinite leave, no forwarding information. The last 3 subjects died within a month, according to a brief memo that arrived at Michael's office with no return address. No names, just subject numbers. Deaths recorded, files sealed, case closed. 6 months later, Michael received a package. No return address, postmarked from Albuquerque. Inside was a single photograph, Patricia Moss before treatment, smiling, standing in front of a chalkboard covered with equations. On the back, someone, Veldman, maybe, or Sarah, had written 6 names in careful script. Patricia Moss. Thomas Chen. David Kerrigan. Marcus Webb. And 2 others Michael hadn't learned about until he read his own classified report back to himself from memory. He kept the photograph in his desk drawer. Sometimes, late at night when Susan was asleep and the house was quiet, he'd take it out and look at Patricia's smile, at the confidence in her eyes. She'd believed in science, in progress, in the possibility that her death might save others. She'd been wrong, but her belief had been real. Michael never took another government contract. When colleagues asked why, he'd cite his age, his health, Susan's desire for him to slow down. All true, but not the real reason. The real reason was simpler: he'd learned that some things, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Some knowledge couldn't be unlearned. And some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, would always find their way to the surface through the cracks in official silence. He'd written his report. He'd documented the truth as clearly as regulations allowed. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in Washington, or buried in an archive in New Mexico, or locked in a safe that would never be opened, that truth waited. Not justice, maybe. Not redemption. But a record that 6 people had lived, had suffered, had died believing their sacrifice meant something. The project officially never happened. But Michael knew different. And now, so do you.